Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the first session of our Spotlight on GitHub Copilot series, Coding with an AI Pair Programmer. My name is Anna. I'm an event planner for Reactor, joining you from Redmond, Washington. Before we start, I have some quick housekeeping. Please take a moment to read our code of conduct. We seek to provide a respectful environment for both our audience and presenters. While we absolutely encourage engagement in the chat, we ask that you please be mindful of your commentary, remain professional, and on topic. Keep an eye on that chat. We'll be dropping helpful links and checking for questions for our presenter to answer live. The session is being recorded. It will be available to view on demand within 24 to 48 hours right here on the Microsoft Reactor channel. With that, I'd love to turn it over to our presenter. Christopher, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where in the world you happen to be. My name is Christopher Harrison. I'm a senior developer advocate at GitHub, primarily focused in on developer experience, or DevX, as all the cool kids like to call it. And in particular, this little thing called GitHub Copilot. I'm really excited to talk about how to get the most out of it and some of the different things that you want to keep in mind as you start to work with your AI pair programmer, or maybe if you've already used it for a little while and are looking for, like, how do I now get the most out of it? How do I now take that to the next level? So that's what I'm going to focus in on. One big thing I always like to highlight is the fact that I'm here for you and not the other way around. So please do ask questions. I'm here to answer all of those. I do have a little bit of a slide deck. I've got a whole bunch of demos and just playing that I want to get in and do as well. So without any further ado, let's get on into it and let's talk about GitHub Copilot. Now, I'm going to breeze through these next couple of slides. I'm going to make a little bit of an assumption that most people that are joining the call are already familiar with Copilot, but I want to define just a couple of terms here real quick to help shape what it is that we're going to get into as we continue to move forward here today. So first up, kind of core GitHub Copilot, or what's now known as code completion. And this was really the first workload that we released with GitHub Copilot, which is I'm writing code and I'm now going to get some ghost text that's going to help predict what it is that I'm looking for in that next block of code. And there's a few different ways that we can take advantage of this. One way is to get in and write some comments. So I'm trying to build out a function. I'm looking to implement some bit of a test. I comment that out, and then Copilot will generate the predicted code based on that. It's also really nice for repetitive code. That I'm a huge fan of a whole bunch of different frameworks. Django, for example, is one of my favorites. But one of the challenges when you're working with a lot of different frameworks is it can be relatively repetitive. That the what's the word that I'm looking for? The ceremony that's required, for example, to create a React component or to create, say, a data object, a data model inside of Django can be a little bit redundant, can be a little bit repetitive. So what's really nice is that Copilot is great at picking up those patterns. So as you're doing that thing, Copilot's then going to suggest the next little block of code, the next little block of code. Additionally, Copilot's great for working with tests. And we can do this actually with both code completion, and then it's really powerful when we get into chat. That I think as developers, if we're being honest here, we all know the importance of unit tests. Like, we're all, I think, big fans of writing unit tests. Actually, I should restate that. I don't think anybody likes writing unit tests, but they like having them there. I think is a better way to phrase that. And so being able to offload that to Copilot is really helpful. And then finally, last but not least, is showing alternatives. So one big thing, and you'll hear this as we go through all of this. You'll hear me say this a handful of times. Is the fact that generative AI is probabilistic, not deterministic. It's making a very educated assumption in in the code that it's going to generate for you. And as a result, it might not always give you exactly what it is that you're looking for. And so you can see different alternatives sometimes, or maybe you can go back and rephrase the comment or rebuild your code, or maybe if you're using chat, kind of build upon what it is that you're doing to really help point it in the right direction. The next workload that we have is GitHub Copilot Chat. And in a nutshell, this is a ChatGPT style of experience right there inside of your editor. That what I can do is I can ask questions, I can highlight a block of code and ask it to do different things, and I can give it different commands on what it is that I am looking to accomplish. So, for example, I can ask generic questions like, what does this code do? Or how does this framework work? I can have it generate unit tests that I can highlight a block of code, say /tests, and it will generate those tests for me. I can tell it to explain the code. I can tell it to generate a fix, or I can also get it to just help me make my code more robust or to make it more secure. So when we're talking about chat, we're going to be talking about that interactive experience that'll be over there. In my case, on the right-hand side, I have my workbench over on the right side. And then when we're talking about code completion, all of that's going to be in line. I do want to hit a couple of very common questions that I wind up getting asked about Copilot. And then I want to start to dig in and take a look at some different demos here and to really kind of hone in on prompt crafting and getting the most out of the tool. So the first big question that I always get asked is, does GitHub Copilot train on my code? And the short answer to this question, if you're using Copilot Business, is no, that none of your code is going to be used to retrain the model. And so that's the code that's being sent up that's part of the context and the suggestions that are sent back down to you. And that then begs the next question. Well, what is this context here that you just mentioned? Well, as you're working with Copilot, and this could be with code completion or with chat, some information about your code is going to be sent up. It's going to use that to generate the response and then send that response back down. What is that context? Well, it's going to vary a little bit. So, first up, if you're using code completion, the context is going to include, here, let me just open up a couple of files here real quick, something like this. What that's going to include when I'm using code completion is it will include the tab that I'm currently working on, and then any other tabs that I have open inside of my IDE. That when I'm using code completion, it's not going to look at my project. It's not going to be able to say, follow any links that I might have. It's not going to automatically open up my package JSON file or my requirements text file or anything like that. It's going to look at the file that I currently have open. And then starting from there, it's going to go out and continue to look at tabs until the buffer is full. That GitHub Copilot can work with 32,000 tokens. So once we fill up that buffer, then it's going to stop from there. Now, this sometimes feels a little bit counterintuitive when I tell people this, that when they're thinking about Copilot, they start to think, oh, well, it must be able to look at the entire project. So why isn't it just looking at my entire project here? Well, here's why. When we're talking about code completion, we've got a little bit of a balance that we need to strike. We want to provide the highest quality suggestions as possible, but we also want to make sure that we're doing it as quick as possible. So if I typed out a comment, like let's say, I don't know, um, register a second API for authentication. Let's say we'll just do like authentication like that. What we want to do is we want to make sure that the response that we get back is both accurate but also quick. Like if I had to wait like 5 seconds for a response to come back here, all that's going to wind up doing is just breaking me out of the flow. And so the way that Copilot is built for code completion is we want to look at what is most likely to be relevant. And if we think about the way that we write code, we're going to typically just naturally open up tabs that are related to what it is that we're building. I'm a web developer, so I'm naturally going to find myself opening up the JavaScript file and opening up the CSS and opening up the HTML and opening up the API. And I'm just naturally going to do that. And so that's why we're looking at those tabs, because we're making an assumption that that is what somebody is most likely going to be relating to. That's going to be most likely the most important code. Now, what that does mean is that for most normal development, keep doing what you're doing. You're just naturally going to find yourself opening up the right tabs because, again, as you just move from file to file, you're just naturally going to do the right thing. But if you are changing context, at that moment, you might want to think about, and I know that this is going to hurt, but I promise it'll be okay, closing your tabs and then starting over so that way you can kind of rebuild that context. Now, again, I want to make sure that I stress here, don't overthink this. That a lot of times when I kind of highlight that fact that it's looking at the tabs and so forth, people get really into the weeds about all of that. Don't don't spend a lot of time and attention thinking about, okay, well, what tabs do I have open and things like that? Because again, 95% of the time, it's just naturally going to work out that you'll just naturally have the right tabs open. It really is just when it comes down to that context switch that I might want to think about a tab, or if I know that I'm doing something that's related to another file, just go open that file real quick and then go back to what it is that you're doing. There's a couple of questions here. Ravi asked the question, in TDD, the test is written before functionality, but every GitHub Copilot demo uses the reverse order. Please, can I show how to properly do TDD with GitHub Copilot? Just thinking, I might be able to do that. I'm going to try. I'm going to highlight one thing real quick about this. So for anybody who's not familiar, normally when you're doing test-driven development, you write the test first, the test fails, and then you go back and you write the code, and then you rerun the test, and the test hopefully succeeds. Kind of the normal flow of things. One nice thing about doing this with Copilot, as opposed to doing this with IntelliSense, is that Copilot will believe you. So in other words, if you say, hey, I'm going to have an API that does this, this, and this, or I'm going to have an SDK that has this signature, it will believe you. And then it will just write the test to go along with that. Whereas with IntelliSense, it really wants that to be created in advance. So it does have that functionality there. I'll see if I can't kind of rework here. I wasn't planning on doing that. So if I wind up doing it, it'll be a live demo. So keep in mind that it might break, but I'll give it my best here when I get in and start doing a little bit of coding. The next question, this is a really big one. How can we get GitHub Copilot writing and optimizing T-SQL queries? Is there a way to train Copilot on our own T-SQL code base? So I'm going to do this in two different ways. So first of all, is there a way to train Copilot on your code base? As of right now, no, but we are working on custom models. So this is something that we are building out. Stay tuned for more information on that. That being said, though, the fastest thing that you can do when writing T-SQL is, we were talking about tabs. This is going to be one of those moments where, let me just kind of, this is going to be one of those moments where having that tab open and like being intentional about it will actually become important. So one of the challenges when you're writing T-SQL is the fact that you need to have a really good understanding of the underlying data structure. So like if I'm writing React and I say create a component, that's pretty well defined. And so Copilot's going to be able to do that all on its own. But when I'm writing SQL, it gets a little trickier because I need to know what the table names are. I need to know what the column names are. And there's like, 70 different conventions and so forth that different people might wind up following. So some people might be using all caps and it's case sensitive. Some might people using lowercase. Some people might be using underscores. Some people might just be using Camel or Pascal casing. Like there's a lot of different things, but some people might be using abbreviations, not using abbreviations. And so it's really tricky for Copilot to then understand what it is that you're trying to do. So what you can do to help Copilot out is if you have open the DDL statement, here we go, inside of a tab, now it's going to be able to look at that and then generate the SQL query based around that. So that's what you're going to want to do is just make sure that you have the DDL open, and that will then help it out. You could either do that in a separate tab or, maybe just here we go. Just have that commented up at the very top, and then down here, go ahead and write whatever queries it is that you might want there. I'm just gonna, there we go, something like this, and then we'll just let it do its values. Give it a second here. Of course, now that I said it's supposed to be going as fast as possible. Yeah, so now it just wants to generate a whole bunch of things. Not necessarily what I want, but that's all right. You start to see where that's going. So the real takeaway here is just make sure that you have that DDL available, and that's going to help it out. The next question then that Christian asks is there a way to provide feedback to Copilot suggestions to help it learn and improve over time? A little bit. So when it comes to code completion, the answer to that is no, because there's not there's no UX that's available to me when I'm working inside of here. But when I'm working in chat, and let's just say explain the table that would be created, something like this. Because we've got this UX over here and we've got this interaction, I do have an up and a down arrow that I can use to signal back. Now, one very big thing to keep in mind about Copilot is that, say, like, unlike your phone, which is going to learn from you and like learn from your behavior. So that way, like every time that you pick up your phone first thing in the morning, it's going to show you, hey, you probably want to open up Facebook. Or maybe that's just me. Copilot doesn't behave that way. So Copilot is not learning from you as it's generating its code, as it's doing its thing. That rather it's that shared model that everybody's going to be using. So it doesn't work that way. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce the name, but the next question up here is, can Copilot be used to patch vulnerabilities? And the answer to that is yes. And there's two different mechanisms that you'll want to be aware of for this. The first is just inside my code. So let's say that I've got some bit of code here. I'm just going to highlight this right here. Then I can just ask it. So when you're working with chat, and I'm just going to kind of work a tip right into this conversation here. When you're working with chat, again, with Copilot, as is true about like most of life, context matters. Context is really, really important. And so the fastest way that you can set context for chat is to highlight the block of code in question. So I just highlight this block of code, and that's now what it's going to focus in on. And so now I can ask that question of like, hey, are there any vulnerabilities? Just like this. And then it will go ahead and give me information about that. And then also give me some updates as well that I could make to my code here. So if I scroll back up, what you're going to notice is that it gives me a real quick overview of what the code does, but there are some potential vulnerabilities. So things like directory traversal, security headers, input validation, rate limiting, public uploads, and so forth. And so it then rewrote that register public for me to now use this additional library and kind of help me out there. So short answer to your question is inside of here, absolutely. One other place where Copilot can help you out is if you're using GitHub Advanced Security, where when I make a pull request, what's going to happen is it will scan my code. Copilot can also help out in there as well and let me know if I have any security vulnerabilities and actually generate a potential fix for that in there. So inside of GitHub Advanced Security, but also just like right here inside of chat, just highlight the block of code. Are there any vulnerabilities? And away you go from there. So cool. Other questions? I want to make sure that I highlight the fact that this is labeled as an AMA, as an Ask Me Anything. So please ask questions. Like, yes, I've got some demos. Yes, I've got some slides, but this is Ask Me Anything. So by all means, ask questions. This is very much what I'm here for. I love this. Okay. So let me do this. Let me gonna do a little bit of cleanup here. Okay. So where I was a minute ago is I was talking about context. So when we're talking about context for code completion, it's going to be can it help write exploits? No. Um, it's the context for code completion is going to be the tab that I'm currently working on and the tabs that are open inside of my IDE. When it comes to chat, things are a little bit different here. And one big thing to keep in mind is that while both chat and code completion are using the same engine and the same technology behind the scenes, the UX, the interface that you have is different. So whereas with code completion, the primary focus is going to be on, hey, we just want to give you code and that's what we're really focused in on. When it comes to chat, it's different because it's, well, chat that we're looking for that little bit of back and forth there. And we also have this UX, we also have this interface right here that I can now take advantage of. So we saw to start. Let me just open up a file here real quick. So the little sample code here that I'm working on is for a website for tracking runners in races, just to give you a little bit of a real quick understanding. But when we're talking about context, the first thing is highlight the block of code. So if I highlight a block of code here, that's now immediately going to set focus. And so when I go in and I ask a question, maybe just something like, explain this code, what you're going to notice is that it then focused in on that block of code. Let me just give it a second here to generate the response. And I'm going to scroll up and we can actually see that right here. So you'll notice it says right here, used one reference. Because again, we have this full user experience that we can now take advantage of. On top of that, I can also go in and get a little fancier here. So this is the backend service. This is going to be the route that's then going to use that backend service. Let me do that same thing here real quick. Let me just say explain. Okay, so I've got my backend service and I've got my route. So it's the route that's going to expose out the API, my backend service. And so this is calling that backend service. I want you to just focus in on that. This is calling that backend service. So when I said explain, I've got a little bit of a formatting issue, but that's all right. You're going to notice that it just focused in on the code that I highlighted. And that's it. That's cool. Gave me a really nice explanation here. But I can also expand this out. And there's a couple of different ways that I can expand that out, but I'm going to start here with explain. So I just typed out / and then EX, and I'm just going to hit tab. And this will automatically include this little thing called at workspace. And what at workspace will do, and this is an oversimplification, but effectively what it's going to do is it's going to create an index of your of your project, of what it is that you have open, in my case in VS Code. And so now when I do the same thing, I'm now getting that explanation back. And let me just scroll back up here. I want you to notice the reference changes. I want you to now notice that it's now using two references, that it's now using that race routes, this block of code that I highlighted, but it's also now calling out to the race service as well to get some information there. Why did it do this? Well, it did this because I've got this at workspace. So at workspace allows me to, on the fly, generate that index. And so it allows it to go beyond that file. Now you might be thinking, well, wait a minute. If I've got that at workspace, can I like keep going with that? Because again, let's think about writing code. Like I said before, like I'm a web developer. And so it's frequent that I'm going to have like an API and a JavaScript file and CSS and HTML and who knows what else that I'm going to be working with. And so when I ask it to do something, I'm going to want to make sure that it understands multiple files here. So for example, let's say on race service, I already have some tests here, but let's say I wanted to generate some tests. I go /tests. You'll notice it includes that again, that out workspace. I've got another really cool command here called #file or #file, depending on your age range. And now I can point this at specific files. So if I know that I've already created some tests, then I can just point it right at that. And if I know that I've already got like a mock context here, then I can point it at that as well. And so now what I'm doing is I'm further setting this context that I'm going, hey, I'm going to ask you to do something. In this case here, I'm going to ask you to write some tests. And when you write those tests, I want you to keep in mind this file, this file, this file, and this file. So I can get really specific about my context when I'm using chat. It's probably one of the most powerful tools here that you have in chat is that capability right there to be able to set that context. Okay. Let me get caught back up on the questions here. If I understood correctly, the answers of Copilot are non-deterministic. So for the same context, you'll get different answers. The short answer to that question is yes. The longer answer to that question is yes. That in the exact same situation, the exact same code, you might get slightly different responses. The exact same prompt and everything being the same. And this is simply the nature of generative AI. Okay, so then what does that mean for me as a developer? Well, for me as the developer, what that's going to mean is I need to be flexible. That I need to kind of roll with things. And like let's think for a little bit about like humans as well. That in a lot of ways humans are probabilistic. That I could ask you, write a block of code that does X today, and then I could go back to you 2 days from now. And even if like you had learned nothing between today and 2 days from now, and I ask you, hey, write a block of code that does X, there's a very good chance you're going to give me a slightly different or maybe even a very different response. It's the same thing with generative AI. And I think the real big lesson, the real takeaway is in a lot of ways, you want to treat GitHub Copilot much in the same way that you would treat a pair programmer. That the tagline for GitHub Copilot is your AI pair programmer. And it's a wonderful tagline, don't get me wrong, but it's also a really nice description about how to best work with it. Like treat it as that pair programmer. And so what that means is a couple of different things. Number one, is you're not always going to get perfection. I don't write perfect code. Maybe you do. Maybe you're cool like that. But I know for me, I don't write perfect code. And the same thing holds true here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that suggestion, I'm going to review that suggestion, and then I'm going to make any updates that I might want, and then I'm going to move on to the next thing from there. But I'm also going to be iterative. So if I'm using code completion and I'm writing in some comments to generate some code, and I don't get exactly what I want, then I'm going to go back and I'm going to reframe things. Or if I'm using chat and I don't get the response that I want back, then I'm going to further clarify. let me do this. I'm going to bring up this slide right here. Help GitHub Copilot help you. Context, intent, clarity, and specificity. And let me give you a little story. Let me give you a little example. My wife and I woke up the other day, and she says to me, "I want to go to brunch." Fantastic. Who doesn't love brunch? And so I recommended a spot. And she said, here's the thing is we've been there quite a bit. I'm kind of burnt out on that. Now, this is a very natural dialogue between two humans. And the reason that that second engagement happened of me suggesting a spot and her coming back and saying, "Hey, I'm kind of burnt out on that place," is context. I was lacking context. I didn't know that she was kind of tired of that space. So what did she do? A very natural follow-up to that. The exact same thing holds true with Copilot. If you get that response back, it might be lacking some context. Give it a little bit more information. So now I go back to that scenario and I go, "Oh, okay, cool." And I recommend a different place. And then she comes back and says, "Yeah, but I really want good coffee. And their coffee is kind of mid." All right. And again, good coffee. Definitely big fan. But now what we're getting into is intent. Like she had a specific goal in mind. She hadn't shared that goal. She wasn't like trying to trick me or anything. Again, this is a very normal human interaction here. So she had a particular intent. And I want to keep that again in mind when I am working with Copilot. That context, here's all the information, the intent. What is that goal that you're looking to achieve? And then finally, those last couple of items, that clarity, that making sure that whatever it is that you're asking Copilot to do, making sure that your code as well is easy to understand. And then again, the level of specificity that when we're talking about code, if I want something to be asynchronous, if I want something to abide by a particular pattern, make sure that you tell Copilot that, like, be specific about that. So is Copilot probabilistic? Yes. But much of what we work with, much of what we interact with on a day-to-day basis is probabilistic. So, we kind of just need to roll with the flow. And we actually have a lot of those skills already in us from just normal human interaction there. So great question. The next question is it safe to assume that better comments of the code result in a better explanation? I swear that Christian was not paid for his questions, but he's leading perfectly into the next slide and into the next slide. Love this. So short answer to that is yes. Longer answer is yes. So let's start a little bit by talking about code. So good code begets good code. This is mostly now frowned upon, but there used to be this feeling that complex code needed to be complex, that complex problems couldn't be easily understood. I think we've all moved beyond that. But even still, that I see an awful lot of code that will use abbreviations or that will use single letter variable names. And here's the problem is abbreviations and single letter variable names are not clear, that they require some innate understanding of the code base. Copilot doesn't have that. And so just as a developer that's new to the project isn't going to have that, Copilot isn't going to have that. So making sure that we have good names, spell things out becomes really important. So good names, spell out those variables. Keep functions functional. I'm showing a bit of my age here, but when I first started writing code, the general rule of thumb is you never wanted a function to be longer than a screen because you wanted to be able to kind of consume that all in one view. And that's very much now no longer the case. But that being said, when you're creating functions, a lot of times developers will wind up creating these like do it all style of functions. And that can be a little bit tricky for Copilot, just as it can be tricky for a new developer to that project to be able to understand how best to work with it. So if you keep your functions functional, kind of keep to those strong principles, you're going to help out Copilot. And then last but not least is be consistent. This is a question that I get asked quite commonly of like, hey, how can I make sure that Copilot is going to follow along with my coding, with my practices? And the answer is do what you're doing. That Copilot is not acting as a lookup service, but rather it's generating code. And so if it sees you using a particular casing pattern, or if it sees you using a particular naming pattern, it's going to follow along with that. So if you're consistent about doing things a particular way, then it's going to follow along with that. The other real big thing, and I'm kind of kicking ahead slides a little bit, but I want to get to this, is it'll also really help if you give inside your files a high-level description of what it is that you're looking to do. Now, it does not have to be this explicit. But if you add in just like 3, 4, 5 lines of comments right up at the very top of the file, just like a header explaining what it is that you're looking to do, how it is that you're looking to do it. And if you're going to be processing data, if you give it some examples of like, hey, this is going to be the input, this is the output that I'm looking for, you're going to notice that the quality of suggestion that you get increases exponential. That one of the things I see with developers when they first get access to Copilot is they'll put in like 2 lines of comments, and then they'll get some relatively generic code and they'll go, oh, this isn't what I was looking for. This tool is useless to me. Again, go back to the brunch conversation, that if you start with a very generic question, the likelihood of you getting back the response that you're looking for is relatively low. The same thing holds true with Copilot here. So if you're more explicit about what it is that you're looking for, if you're more detailed about what it is that you're looking for, that's really going to help Copilot out. Okay. Let's see. There's a couple of other questions that I don't really have answers for. With code completion, is there a way to tune the size of the suggestion? That you might just want to have a whole line or a function. Copilot doesn't always understand what you want at the moment. Yeah, so this is where chat comes into play, that if you highlight just that individual block, then it's going to look at that. So this is the real big difference when it comes to context between code completion and chat. With code completion, it's always going to be the file that you're in, the tabs that you have open. That's hard coded. That's the way that it's working. But chat, because again, you have this interface here, it's going to be able to allow you to choose that context. So if you just wanted to look at a particular block, then just grab that block and then go ahead and ask your questions right here. So whatever it is that you're looking to do. So Lee asked the question, so Copilot will use mocks and interfaces, not the implementations. If you tell it to, yes. And that's always going to be the key. A little bit of story time here. Before joining Microsoft and then in turn GitHub, I was a technical trainer for years and years and years. And I posted out to what was then Twitter, he says with a smile, that I really wish that trainers would teach developers best practices at all times. And somebody responded back and they said, there's no such thing as best practices. Now, of course, this being Twitter and 180 characters or whatever the limit was at that time, there's of course no time for nuance. And as we went back and forth a little bit, I finally understood the point that he was making, which is that depending on where you are and what it is that you're doing, you're going to write your code differently. That the way that I'm going to write code for production when scaling is our primary concern is going to be one way. The way that I'm going to write it for maybe a smaller application or maybe for a POC or maybe for just like a hackathon is all going to be very, very different. That the approaches that I'm going to take here, here, and here are going to be different. And so that's the argument that he was making when it came to there are no best practices. And it's a very valid argument. And so again, when we think back to Copilot, and I get Copilot to generate some bit of code, I want to kind of keep that same thing in mind is that there are no best practices. There is no spoon that depending on what it is that I'm doing and how it is that I'm approaching it, I'm going to want different tacks. I'm going to want different styles of code. And so when it comes to doing things like unit testing, it can absolutely do mock objects that if I open up everything that I'm working in this project here was generated or was helped by Copilot. So when I go in and I look at all my code, you'll notice that I'm using mock objects inside of here. Copilot helped me write all of that. So it absolutely is able to do that, but you'll have to give it a little bit of guidance. You'll have to kind of tell it, hey, I need this mock object. Hey, this is the library that I want to use. Like really kind of give it that bit of context so that way you can give that back to you. So yeah. Um, let's see. Um, Copilot writes clean code. Then Copilot will promote clean code if you are writing clean code. That there's very much, for want of a better way to put this, a garbage in, garbage out. And this is true with like all of machine learning and large language models or LLMs are certainly no different. That if I'm writing bad code, then Copilot's going to follow along with that. If I'm writing good code, Copilot is going to follow along with that. So Mary asked the question, will it help out code or generate code with accessibility suggestions, something outputs the HTML in the end? I am so glad you asked this question. Accessibility is something that's very important to me, especially as a web developer. And so a couple of things on that. Number one, just like I was mentioning, lots of different ways that you can write things. Make sure in your context that you're very clear about how it is that you want that code to be generated. Additionally, if it sees you already doing things in an accessible fashion, it will follow along with that. So if it sees, for example, that you're already using alt tags and you're already using ARIA labels and like those types of things, it will follow right along with that. If it doesn't see you do that, however, it's very likely that it's not going to automatically suggest that. Additionally, if it already sees you doing bad things, like if it sees you using link buttons, for example, it's going to follow right along with that. It's going to use link buttons as well. So as long as you're doing it the right way, then it is going to follow along with that. Do I have an HTML file in here? I think I do. Question mark. Public. Yeah. So let me just do this is let me just ask chat. Yeah. So I can actually just ask it right inside of here about how best to manage accessibility, and you'll notice that it actually picked up a couple of items here. So making sure that I've got a proper ID, that my H1. Why does my H1 contain a div? That shouldn't be that case at all. Yeesh, who wrote this HTML? Uh, but it actually picked up those errors. And so now I can go ahead and just apply an editor and it will go ahead and make those updates for me. I'll give that just a second to add that in. There we go. Cool. So yeah. By the way, while I'm here, I also want to highlight this. So let's say I go into chat and I ask chat a question, or I ask it to generate some block of code. You'll notice that you get kind of three options here on how to interact with that code. So the first is copy. I'll let you figure out what copy is going to do on your own. It's going to copy it to the clipboard. The next is insert at cursor. And so what this will do is wherever my cursor happens to be inside my file, it will then basically just blindly put in that entire block of code for you. And sometimes that's what you're looking for, especially if all that it does is it generates just a function and that's it. The last one, and this is the one that I find myself using probably about 90% of the time, and that is the option that you just saw me use. Let me actually just undo all of my code here. There we go. Um, is this apply in editor? So what this is going to do is this is going to use a little bit of AI to figure out what the appropriate updates are to make to the code. That one big thing that you're going to notice about the suggestions that are generated in chat is a lot of times it will include the entire file, or it will include like a large portion of the file, or it will like include part of it and then like a placeholder and then the new code and then another placeholder and then maybe some like close down below. And what it's trying to do when it's giving you that type of a response is it's just trying to give you more context, just is trying to give you more information about the code that it's generating and how that's going to fit into what it is that you're doing. So with that in mind, the question then becomes, okay, well, if this is like the only block that I want, let's just say that's all that I want. Now I have to go in, I have to highlight that, I have to copy that, I have to paste that in. That's a little clunky. So what I can do is I can then apply an editor. And so when I hit apply an editor, it will look at all of my code here. It will look at the suggestion and then figure out what the appropriate updates are that it needs to make. And of course, because I'm working with AI, it worked the first time and it didn't work the second time. Um, All right, let's try this one more time. Live demos. Here we go. This is better. Okay. Now, this is where using your editor really becomes key, because when it made the update to the code, this might be not overly clear of like, okay, well, what exactly did it update? Well, one of the things that you'll notice right here in VS Code, which is the editor that I'm using, is that I'm getting these little like blue barber pole stripes here. And what that's showing me is those are the lines that have been edited. So before I accept this code, I'm going to go through those lines and make sure that, yes, those are the updates that I was expecting. All of this code looks good. And then now I'm going to save that and then move on to the next part, which actually leads me into yet another very important point. Generative AI does not replace developers. It also does not replace your normal DevOps process. This does not replace code reviews, security scans, IP checks, linters. None of that is replaced. Think about the way that we write code without generative AI. Then I'm going to write some of that based off of my own understanding. Some of that I'm going to copy and paste from Stack Overflow. And I love Stack Overflow, don't get me wrong. But when I'm copying and pasting from there, a lot of times I'm just like modifying things, crossing my fingers and hoping that it builds. I'm getting code from documentation. I'm getting code from other parts of the project that I'm copying and I'm pasting in. And in all of those scenarios, I of course am trying to read my code and make sure that it does what I'm expecting it to do, but I also have a manual code review. I also have those linters, those security checks, and everything else that I'm doing to help make sure that the code that I'm generating is good code. All of that remains the same when we're using Copilot. Copilot does not replace your DevOps process. Okay. Let's see. Is there a validator for the ML as well? Yeah, you can do the same thing with markup or with markdown language, or really kind of anything. Just highlight it and just start asking those questions in there. The next question is: are there some languages that it works better with than others? So GitHub Copilot is built upon a large language model, an LLM. And the quality of suggestion that you're going to see is always going to be proportional to the training set. So for languages like Java, JavaScript, C#, HTML, where it's seen an awful lot, it's going to be wonderful. For emerging languages, maybe something like Rust, or for languages where there's just not necessarily a large public code base, say like COBOL, the quality of suggestion might not be as great. And that's just simply the nature of working with an LLM. However, as we've already highlighted, context is key. And Copilot and LLMs in general are wonderful pattern matchers. So if I'm trying to do something in COBOL and I've already got some code that I can show it, it's going to work really well with that. So if you follow along with those practices, it will work really well with that. Cool. All right. I've got about 10 minutes left here. Um, and I know that there was a great question about writing tests first and then coming back. Ravi, you had asked that question right at the very beginning. And unfortunately, we wound up chatting a little bit too much. Here's what I'm going to do for you, though. I'm committing to this and I'm doing this on camera. I'm going to write up a blog post on that and put together a couple of demos with that because I think that this is a great question. And I'm really bummed that I didn't get around to actually doing it. I don't think I can do it justice in 9 minutes. So I want to make sure that I call that out. And I'm committing right here. You're hearing it here first. I am going to write a blog post on doing that. So because I think that's such a great question, so important. Okay. Let's see. Couple of other things that I want to highlight to close out. So actually, before I get to the slide, let me do this. Let me just open this up. Okay. So if you're anything like me, and I know I am, if I ever need to learn a new service, the first place that I'm going is I'm going to Google or I'm going to Bing or I'm going to YouTube, but I'm going to a search engine to go look up how to work with some framework. Now, that's a wonderful approach. And absolutely, even with Copilot, I will still do that today. However, my first step these days is to actually start with Copilot. And let me show you why. So, this service here is using a backend object relational mapper or ORM known as Prisma. And so what I could do is I could go off to Google and I can go, what is Prisma? And it will give me back, links to the documentation. And when I look through the links, when I look through the documentation and I look through the tutorials, it's going to give me something relatively generic that it's going to show me like how to write a store or how to write a blog or something like that. And then what I'm having to do is I'm now having to translate from that to what it is that I'm trying to build. What I've updated my workflow to now do, my own personal workflow, is I'll start by asking here. So I'm going to go, what is Prisma? And so now what you're going to notice is that it will give me back again, kind of this high level overview of what Prisma is. And now let me follow this up by saying, how could I create a data type in Prisma? And the response that it's going to give back to me is based on the project that I've got. And this is something that I really like here is now rather than having to translate of like, oh, okay, well, that's how I would build it with a blog post, but how would I really build that for my project here? Well, now when I ask this question, I'm getting an example back that's similar to what it is that I'm building. Or another big place where I'll use chat is in a scenario where I know that something is possible, but I just don't remember exactly how to do it. And I know that it's something that's a little bit esoteric, and I would really have to dig into the documentation. As an example, if you're not already familiar with Django, Django is a fantastic web framework. And one of the things that you can do is you can create these little commands that you can then call from the command line to like do things behind the scenes. And it's something that is kind of an edge case. And so there is documentation. The documentation is wonderful, but I then always have to like remember where it is and go in and dig it up and so forth. But if I start right here in chat and I ask those types of questions here, now the responses that I'm going to get back, A, are immediate, but also B, are going to be tailored to what it is that I'm doing. So if you basically take nothing else away from this entire hour here, it would be this is when you go to ask those types of generic questions, start in chat. This is going to help keep you in the zone, but it's also going to help give you responses that are more formed to what it is that you're doing. A couple of other last quick tips. Again, Copilot's going to look at the tabs when you're using code completion. Formality is not required. So we had that slide up where you had like, 10 lines of code at the very top. Formality isn't required. A couple, 3 lines of comments up at the very top going to go a long way to helping to improve the quality of suggestion. And there also isn't one right way to use Copilot because of the fact that this is probabilistic rather than deterministic, that you're going to discover new ways to use Copilot. And as you do that, document that somewhere, write that somewhere, share that with your team so that way they learn. Like there was a question earlier about, hey, what about T-SQL? And opening up the DDL. I remember being at an internal client event and they were having different developers kind of bring in their own little success stories. And that actually turned out to be one of them, that somebody had been writing SQL, getting really bad results. And then they said, all right, well, let me just open up the tab and let me just see what happens. And then voila, everything worked. They shared that out with the team. So as you discover those things, share that out. And really, above all else, go with the flow. And I think that this is just like a good lesson for life, but certainly with Copilot. That again, you're going to notice at times that it will give you exactly what you want. You're going to notice at times it's close but not quite right. You're also going to notice, quite frankly, at times that it's also going to give you something that's wrong. But if you are flexible, if you rephrase the comment, if you re-ask, if you work iteratively, that just follow up on a question if you're using chat or add in a couple of additional comments describing what it is that you're looking to do when you're using code completion, you're going to notice that your quality will improve greatly. Fantastic. Any other last questions here? I got about like 2 minutes left. Beautiful. With that, I want to thank everybody for tuning in. I know that the URL for my little code was pasted here. If you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, by all means, feel free to send me the request on there. My handle basically everywhere is Geek Trainer, and you can. Oh, all right. It didn't post, but my handle everywhere is basically Geek Trainer. Here, I'll just type it into here. Um, there we go. And you can basically find me anywhere there. Where will the blog post be? Hit me up on LinkedIn, and I'll let you know from there. It'll probably be on Dev2. It might find its way to the GitHub blog, but it'll certainly be on Dev2. So just hit me up on LinkedIn, and I can point you at that. So please do fill out the survey. You can see that kind of scrolling down below, right there. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you, Christopher, for an awesome session. To learn more about our series, you can follow the link at the bottom of the screen or in the chat. We're always looking to improve our sessions and your experience. If you have any feedback for us, we would love to hear what you have to say. You can also find that link on the screen or in the chat. Today's event code is 23377. We'll see you on the next one.